I've been a wilderness officer for almost 2 decades, working in some of the most remote areas in the Pacific Northwest. I've seen my fair share of strange occurrences, unexplained lights, missing hikers, even bizarre animal behavior. But nothing prepared me for my final assignment at Clearwater Basin Preserve. The basin is an expansive stretch of wilderness, thick pine forests, glacial lakes, and jagged cliffs. It's the kind of place where you feel utterly alone, even when surrounded by nature's beauty. This place has always had a reputation, even among seasoned outdoors enthusiasts. Locals tell stories of hikers vanishing without a trace, of strange sounds echoing through the woods at night. As someone who prides himself on logic and practicality, I dismissed those tales as exaggerations or urban legends. At least I used to. It was early spring when I was transferred to Clearwater Basin. The preserve was undergoing changes, campsite rotations, trail maintenance, and an overhaul of our safety protocols. My supervisor, a no-nonsense ranger named Tom Burrows, welcomed me with a firm handshake and a clipboard full of tasks. "We're behind schedule," Tom said, his gruff voice matching the weathered lines on his face. "Snow melted late this year, and we've got to inspect every campsite before the season opens. You'll take the Eastern Ridge, report anything out of place." The Eastern Ridge was notorious for its rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. It wasn't the most popular area for campers, but we maintained a handful of sites there for the more adventurous types. The hike out was uneventful, the fresh scent of pine and the distant murmur of a creek providing a sense of calm. I checked the first few sites, clear, untouched. Nature was reclaiming its space, as it should. Then I reached Site 14. The moment I stepped into the clearing, unease crept over me. The site was a mess, torn tents, broken camping gear, and something far more disturbing. Scratches gouged deep into the bark of surrounding trees, forming strange, almost runic patterns. I found no blood, no bodies, but the signs of chaos were undeniable. The ground was churned up as if a struggle had taken place. I radioed Tom immediately. "Burrows, this is Donovan. I've got an issue at Site 14. The place looks trashed, gear destroyed, strange markings on the trees. No sign of campers. What's the protocol?" There was a long pause before his voice crackled back. "Stay put. I'll send a team." While I waited, I examined the area more closely. One of the tents had been shredded, but there was something odd about the damage. It didn't look like the work of a bear or any other animal I was familiar with. The tears were too precise, almost surgical. I spotted a trail leading deeper into the forest, marked by snapped branches and trampled undergrowth. Against my better judgment, I followed it. About 50 yards in, I found something that froze me in place. A circle of stones, arranged meticulously around what appeared to be a pile of ash. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I knelt down, brushing some of the ash aside with a gloved hand. Underneath were charred fragments of bone, too small to be human, but unmistakably unnatural. Before I could examine further, the forest erupted in sound. Branches snapping, distant rustling, something large moving through the trees. I drew my flashlight, scanning the dense brush, but saw nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The hairs on my neck stood on end. "Donovan, team's en route. Stay where you are." Tom's voice crackled over the radio. I hurried back to Site 14, unease growing with each step. When Tom arrived with 2 other rangers, I showed them the markings, the destruction, and the trail leading to the stone circle. Tom's expression darkened. "This isn't animal behavior," he muttered almost to himself. "Pack it up. We're reporting this to the higher-ups." The next day, Tom called an all-hands meeting at the station. Clearwater Basin's staff was small, just 6 of us, including Tom, but the room felt tense as he outlined new procedures. "Effective immediately, Site 14 and the surrounding trails are off-limits," Tom announced. "All rangers are to carry firearms on patrol, no exceptions, and if you encounter anything unusual, you report it directly to me or HQ. Understood?" The room murmured with uneasy agreement. One of the rookies, Jenna, raised her hand. "Tom, do we know what we're dealing with? Is it poachers, a rogue predator?" Tom hesitated before answering. "We're not sure yet. That's why we're taking precautions." Over the next few weeks, the preserve's atmosphere shifted. We began hearing strange reports from visitors, unexplained lights in the woods, a low hum in the air at night. One camper claimed to have woken up to find his tent surrounded by footprints, though no one had been seen entering or leaving the area. I started to notice other things too. The forest seemed quieter than usual, as if the animals were avoiding certain areas. The air near Site 14 felt colder even on warm days. Once, while patrolling a nearby trail, I found a small pile of stones arranged in a spiral pattern, eerily similar to the circle I'd seen before. Tom seemed increasingly on edge. He spent long hours in his office, poring over maps and making cryptic phone calls. One night I caught a glimpse of his computer screen, images of the markings from Site 14, alongside what looked like ancient symbols and diagrams. He quickly shut the laptop when he noticed me. "Is there something you're not telling us?" I asked. Tom sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Donovan, some things are better left alone. Just follow orders, and we'll get through this." A few days later, things took a darker turn. It started with a routine patrol. Jenna and I were assigned to the western trails far from Site 14. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of peaceful day that reminded me why I loved this job. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest's demeanor shifted. The air grew colder, heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. We were about halfway through our loop when we heard it. A low guttural sound, like the growl of an animal but distorted, as though it was coming from underwater. Jenna froze, her hand instinctively resting on the grip of her sidearm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, motioning for her to stay quiet. We scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. The growl came again, this time closer. It seemed to reverberate through the ground, making my chest tighten. I signaled for Jenna to fall back, and we began retreating toward the main trail. That's when we saw it. About 30 yards away, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure. At first glance it looked human, a tall silhouette with long, gangly limbs. But as we focused, the details became wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. Its head tilted toward us, and even from that distance, I could feel its gaze, a piercing, predatory stare. "Run," I whispered, gripping Jenna's arm. We sprinted back to the station, not stopping until we were safely inside. My heart was pounding, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. Jenna was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her radio. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted, though the truth was clawing at the edges of my mind. Whatever it wasn't human. Tom was waiting for us in the main hall. His face darkened when we told him what happened. Without a word, he grabbed his rifle and headed out into the night. I tried to follow, but he stopped me at the door. "Stay here, Donovan, that's an order." Tom returned hours later, empty-handed and visibly shaken. He called another meeting the next morning, his tone grim. "Effective immediately, the entire eastern ridge is off limits," he said. "We're also implementing a strict curfew. No one leaves the station after dark. If you see anything unusual, report it and wait for backup. Do not engage. Understood?" There were no objections. Even the rookies, who had been skeptical of the new protocols, seemed unnerved. Over the next few days, the preserve's tension mounted. Visitors trickled in during the day, but left well before sunset. Staff patrols were reduced to daylight hours only, and even then we stayed in pairs. Despite the precautions, the strange occurrences continued. Cameras placed near Site 14 captured fleeting glimpses of movement, shadows darting between trees, faint glows that disappeared the moment they were in focus. One night, while reviewing the footage, I caught something that sent a chill down my spine. A figure appeared on the edge of the frame, just for a moment. It was the same gangly, unnatural shape Jenna and I had seen in the woods, but this time it was closer. I showed the footage to Tom. His face hardened, and he deleted the file without a word. 2 weeks after the encounter, we received a report from a group of hikers who had strayed into the restricted zone. They claimed to have found an abandoned campsite near Site 14, one that hadn't been there before. They described strange symbols carved into the surrounding trees and a spiral of stones at the center. Tom ordered a team to investigate. I volunteered, along with Jenna and another ranger, Mark. Armed and on edge, we hiked to the location the hikers had described. When we arrived, my stomach dropped. The campsite was identical to the one I'd found during my first patrol. Same shredded tents, same strange markings. But there was something new. A faint trail of ash leading away from the spiral. We followed it cautiously, rifles at the ready. The trail led us to a clearing, where we found something that defied explanation. At the center of the clearing was a circle of trees, their trunks blackened as though burned from the inside out. The ground was littered with charred bones, some large enough to belong to a bear or elk, others disturbingly small. Mark knelt to examine one of the trees, his hand brushing against the scorched bark. As he did, the forest seemed to come alive. A deafening roar filled the air, and the ground beneath us trembled. The shadows between the trees began to writhe, twisting and coalescing into shapes that seemed almost alive. "Move!" I shouted, dragging Mark to his feet. We ran as fast as we could, the roar following us all the way back to the station. When we burst through the door, Tom was already on the phone, his face pale. He hung up as we entered, his expression grim. "They're sending a team," he said. "Until then, no one leaves the station." The next morning, a convoy of unmarked vehicles arrived at Clearwater Basin. Men in tactical gear, armed to the teeth, fanned out across the preserve. Their leader, a tall, stone-faced man who introduced himself only as Reynolds, briefed us quickly. "This area is now under federal jurisdiction," he said. "Your job is to assist us by staying out of the way. Understood?" Tom nodded reluctantly, and we watched as the team disappeared into the woods. Hours passed, and then the gunfire started. Short bursts at first, then a cacophony of automatic weapons. The sound echoed through the trees, mingling with unearthly roars that made my blood run cold. Reynolds and his team returned just before dusk, their numbers noticeably smaller. He didn't offer an explanation, only issued a final order. The preserve was to be closed permanently. Clearwater Basin was officially closed within the week. Signs went up around the perimeter warning of hazardous conditions, and a fence was erected to keep people out. The story fed to the public was simple. A dangerous landslide had destabilized the area, making it unsafe for visitors. But those of us who had been there knew the truth was far stranger and far more terrifying. The remaining staff, including myself, were reassigned to other parks. Tom retired early, though I suspect retired wasn't his choice. Jenna transferred to a small nature preserve in Idaho, while Mark decided to leave the field entirely, opting for a desk job with the Forestry Service. As for me, I was sent to Blue Hollow Reserve, a quiet, picturesque park in northern Montana. It seemed like a peaceful place, a fresh start, but the shadows of Clearwater Basin followed me. Blue Hollow Reserve was everything Clearwater wasn't. Calm, well-maintained, and devoid of the eerie atmosphere that had permeated the basin. For the first few weeks, I found myself relaxing for the first time in years. The job was straightforward, the trails were well-marked, and the campers were respectful of the rules. It felt like I'd left the horrors of the basin behind. Until one night, during a routine patrol. It was just past midnight, and I was walking the perimeter of the main campground. The air was crisp, the moon casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I reached the edge of the trail, I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping, like someone gently rapping on wood. I froze, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing. The tapping stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the same distorted growl I'd heard at Clearwater Basin. I radioed back to the station. "This is Donovan. I think we've got a bear or something near the northern trailhead. I'm heading back." My voice was steadier than I felt. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its head tilted slightly as if studying me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it stepped forward and the light caught its face. Except it didn't have a face. Where its features should have been was smooth, pale skin, devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure cocked its head almost curiously, then melted into the shadows. I ran back to the station, not stopping until I was safely inside. My colleagues, a pair of older rangers named Claire and Harris, looked up in surprise as I burst through the door. "Donovan, what the hell happened?" Claire asked, rising from her chair. "There's something out there," I gasped. "It's not human." The next day I reported the incident to my supervisor, a middle-aged ranger named Dale. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "Are you sure it wasn't just an animal? Shadows can play tricks on you at night." I shook my head. "I know what I saw, Dale. This wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was something else." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'll file a report, but don't expect much. These kinds of claims don't get a lot of traction." I left his office feeling frustrated and uneasy. As the days passed, I started to notice other oddities around the reserve. Campers reported hearing strange noises at night, whispers carried on the wind, faint tapping sounds coming from the trees. A few even claimed to have seen lights moving through the forest, though no one could agree on what they looked like. One evening, while reviewing footage from the trail cameras, I spotted something that sent a chill down my spine. In one clip, a faint humanoid shape appeared briefly between the trees. It was too distant to make out details, but its movements were all too familiar. I showed the footage to Dale, but he dismissed it as a trick of the light. Could be anything, a deer, a shadow, even a smudge on the lens. Don't read too much into it. But I knew better. A week later, the disappearances began. The first was a solo hiker, a young man named Eric who had been exploring the northern trails. When he failed to return to his campsite, a search party was organized. We combed the woods for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. The only clue we found was his backpack, abandoned near a creek. The straps were torn, as if by something with immense strength. The second disappearance happened 2 days later. This time, it was a family of 3, parents and their teenage daughter. They had been camping near the southern edge of the reserve, well away from the northern trails. Their tent was found intact, but the family was gone. The fire pit was still warm, and their belongings were untouched. Panic began to spread among the staff. Dale tried to reassure us, but his own unease was evident. He instituted new rules. All patrols were to be conducted in pairs, and no one was to enter the forest after sunset. But even with these precautions, the sense of dread was inescapable. One night, while patrolling with Claire, I heard the tapping again. It was faint at first, but grew louder as we approached a clearing. There in the center of the clearing was a spiral of stones, just like the one I'd seen at Clearwater Basin. "Donovan, what is this?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was stare at the spiral, my mind racing with memories of the basin. Whatever had haunted that place had followed me here. Claire and I retreated from the clearing as quickly as we could. The spiral of stones was too familiar, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Whatever force had created it had left its mark here in Blue Hollow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us even as we walked away. When we returned to the station, we reported our discovery to Dale. He listened in silence, his face pale. After we finished, he closed his office door, leaving us to wonder what he knew but wasn't sharing. The next few days passed in tense silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum of life replaced by an oppressive quiet. Even the campers, normally eager to explore, stayed close to the main trails. Reports of strange noises, growls, whispers, and that infernal tapping became more frequent, but Dale seemed determined to downplay the incidents. One night, while I was on patrol with Harris, the station's floodlights suddenly went out. The darkness was immediate and absolute, pressing in from all sides. Our flashlights seemed to barely pierce it, their beams swallowed by the void. "This can't be a coincidence," Harris muttered, his voice shaky. "Something's messing with us." We radioed back to the station, but the line crackled with static. Then in the distance we saw them, faint glowing orbs floating through the trees. They bobbed and weaved, their movements unnaturally smooth. At first I thought they might be fireflies, but their light was too steady, too bright. As the orbs drew closer, a familiar growl echoed through the woods. My grip tightened on my rifle, but Harris grabbed my arm. "Don't shoot," he whispered. "We don't know what they are." We stood frozen as the lights circled us, their glow casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving us alone in the suffocating dark. When we finally made it back to the station, we found Dale pacing nervously. The power had returned, but his expression was grim. "It's happening again, isn't it?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. The next morning, Dale gathered the staff for an emergency meeting. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by barely concealed panic. "Whatever's out there, it's escalating," he said. "I've contacted the Forestry Service and the Department of Interior. They're sending a team, but it could take days. Until then, we're shutting down the reserve. No patrols, no campers. Everyone stays here at the station." "What are we dealing with, Dale?" I demanded. "You know more than you're telling us." Dale hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. Finally, he spoke. "Years ago, when I first started, I worked at a preserve up north. We had incidents, disappearances, strange phenomena. The higher-ups called it a localized anomaly. But it was more than that. It was like the land itself was alive, and it didn't want us there. They closed the preserve, buried the records, and moved everyone to different assignments. I thought I'd left it behind, but now—" He trailed off, and the room fell into a heavy silence. No one dared to ask the obvious question: what happened to the people who didn't leave? That night, the station felt like a fortress under siege. The floodlights illuminated the surrounding woods, casting long, flickering shadows. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, the tapping started again, louder this time. It seemed to come from all directions, as if the trees themselves were knocking against one another. Then came the growl, low and guttural, vibrating through the floor. "We can't just sit here," Claire said, her voice tight with fear. "What if it comes inside?" Dale shook his head. "We stay put. Reinforcements will be here in the morning." But morning felt an eternity away. As the hours dragged on, the noises grew louder, more chaotic. The tapping became a deafening drumbeat, and the growls gave way to unearthly howls. Then the lights went out again. Panic set in. Claire and Harris grabbed flashlights and huddled near the door. I held my rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. Dale stood by the window, peering into the darkness. "It's testing us," he muttered. "It wants us to run." Suddenly the windows shattered, and a freezing wind swept through the station. Shadows moved in the darkness, their forms indistinct but undeniably there. One by one, they pressed against the walls, their shapes shifting and writhing. I raised my rifle, but Dale grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said. "You'll only make it worse." The shadows grew bolder, slipping through the broken windows and pooling on the floor like living smoke. One of them reached for Harris, its tendrils curling around his leg. He screamed, thrashing wildly as it pulled him toward the door. Without thinking, I fired. The sound was deafening, the recoil jarring, but the shadow recoiled, releasing Harris. It writhed in the light of the muzzle flash, then vanished. "That's it," Dale said. "We need to hold out until dawn." The hours that followed were the longest of my life. We barricaded the windows, using every flashlight and flare we could find to keep the shadows at bay. The tapping and howling never stopped, but the creatures never breached our defenses again. Finally, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the noises ceased. The shadows retreated, melting into the forest as if they had never been there. Outside, the woods were eerily still, the aftermath of a storm that had left no trace. Reynolds and his team arrived later that morning. They swept through the station, confiscating all evidence, trail camera footage, logs, even our personal phones. We were debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and reassigned to different locations. Blue Hollow Reserve was closed indefinitely, labeled a protected area under federal law. Officially, it was due to concerns about soil erosion and wildlife conservation. Unofficially, we knew the truth. Some places aren't meant to be inhabited. I have since left the service, choosing a quiet life far from the wilderness. But the memories of Clearwater Basin and Blue Hollow still haunt me. Sometimes late at night I hear the tapping, the faint rhythmic sound that once signaled something far darker. Whatever it is, it's still out there, watching, waiting, and I know deep down that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. When I first saw the job posting for a fire watch position in North Haven National Forest, I thought it was a dream come true. A solitary job, perched in a lookout tower deep in the wilderness, seemed like the perfect escape from my stressful life in the city. I'd spent years working as a data analyst, soul-crushing hours staring at spreadsheets in a dim office. The thought of breathing fresh air and being surrounded by nature was all I needed to pack my bags and apply. I wasn't sure I'd get the job. The application process was competitive, with hundreds of candidates eager for the opportunity. But luck seemed to favor me. A week after my interview, I received an offer letter. I was ecstatic. The ranger I spoke with, a gruff-sounding man named Ed, gave me the details. I'd spend 7 days in a fire lookout tower, monitoring the forest for any signs of smoke or danger. It was remote, peaceful, and perfect. The contract came with some conditions. I had to complete a week of training at the base camp before my first shift. It was standard protocol, Ed explained, to ensure I knew how to handle emergencies, navigate the forest, and use the equipment. The training was uneventful, mostly lectures about fire safety and radio operations. I spent most of the week itching to get out of the classroom and into the wilderness. Finally, the day came to visit the lookout tower. Ed drove me there himself, steering his truck through winding dirt roads that cut through the dense pine forest. The canopy above us blocked most of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the road. "So this your first time working in the field?" Ed asked, his eyes fixed on the road. "Yeah," I admitted. "I've done some hiking, but nothing like this." He chuckled. "You'll get used to it. Just remember, the job's not as romantic as it sounds. You're up there alone, and the forest can mess with your head, but stick to the rules and you'll be fine." "What kind of rules?" I asked, curious. Ed hesitated, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "You'll see when you get there." When the tower came into view, my breath caught in my throat. It was perched atop a rocky hill, its stilts rising high above the treetops. The structure looked both majestic and precarious, like it belonged in a postcard. A narrow staircase wound its way up to the cabin at the top, which was surrounded by a wraparound deck. The view was stunning, even from the ground. Ed parked the truck and handed me a small duffel bag filled with supplies. "They should last you a week. You've got a radio up there to call in anything serious, but keep in mind it's a solo gig. If you need backup, it could take hours for someone to reach you." He started up the stairs, and I followed, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and unease. The steps creaked under our weight, and I couldn't help but glance down at the drop below. Heights weren't my favorite thing, but I pushed the thought aside. When we reached the top, Ed unlocked the door and gestured for me to step inside. The cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, complete with a stove, sink, and mini fridge. A cot with a neatly folded blanket sat against one wall, and a desk with a map of the forest took up the center of the room. Windows lined all 4 walls, offering an uninterrupted view of the surrounding wilderness. "This'll be your home for the week," Ed said. "You'll need to check the forest every 30 minutes during the day and every hour at night. Log the weather conditions and keep an eye out for any signs of smoke. Oh, and don't leave the tower unless it's an absolute emergency." "Understood," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Ed handed me a binder. "This is your manual. Everything you need to know is in here. First thing you should do is read it, and remember, stick to the rules." He left me alone after that, his truck disappearing down the road. I stood at the window staring out at the endless expanse of green. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm. The first few hours were uneventful. I spent some time unpacking my supplies and exploring the cabin. I found a pair of binoculars on the desk, along with a radio and a notebook for logging my observations. The cupboards were stocked with canned goods, and a small emergency kit sat under the sink. As the sun began to set, I stepped out onto the deck to take in the view. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the forest below bathed in a golden glow. I snapped a few photos with my phone, already imagining the likes they'd get on social media when I got back to civilization. By the time twilight set in, I decided to dive into the manual. It was full of the standard stuff: how to report a fire, what to do in case of an injury, and tips for dealing with wildlife. But as I flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper fell out. It was handwritten, its edges frayed as if it had been passed between many hands. I unfolded it and read, "The rules 1. Never leave the cabin after dark. 2. If you hear knocking on the walls or the floor, do not respond. 3. If the radio crackles between midnight and 2 a.m., turn it off immediately. 4. If you see a light in the forest moving toward the cabin, close the shutters and hide. 5. Don't answer the voices that come from outside." I stared at the note, a chill creeping up my spine. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, as if whoever wrote it was in a hurry. It didn't match the professional tone of the manual, and there was no explanation for the rules. "Probably just a prank," I muttered, folding the note and slipping it back into the binder. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was swallowed by darkness, the words lingered in my mind. The first night in the tower was both exciting and unnerving. The sheer isolation was palpable. The forest, alive and vibrant during the day, seemed to transform under the cover of darkness. The distant hoots of owls and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me I wasn't entirely alone, though it did little to soothe the creeping unease. I completed my first nighttime scan of the forest at 9 p.m., rotating slowly around the deck with binoculars in hand. The trees below were a black void, blending into the horizon. I tried to focus on the task, but the memory of the note tugged at the edges of my thoughts. What could those rules possibly mean? Lights moving through the forest, knocking sounds, and why the insistence on not leaving the cabin after dark? Rationality told me it was a joke, a hazing ritual for rookies. But part of me couldn't shake the idea that it was a warning, a genuine, desperate attempt to prepare me for something I wasn't ready for. At 11 p.m., I heard the first strange sound. It was faint at first, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from below the cabin. My initial thought was a branch knocking against the stilts. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the trap door to the deck, shining the beam downward. Nothing. The sound stopped as soon as I opened the trap door. I scanned the area, but saw only the quiet, empty forest. Shaking my head, I closed the trap door and locked it. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow in the stillness. By midnight, the forest was silent, eerily so. Even the distant owl calls had ceased. I decided to distract myself by reading, though I couldn't focus on the words. The oppressive quiet seemed to seep into the cabin, making every creak of the wood feel like an intrusion. At exactly 12:17 a.m., the radio came to life. Static crackled through the room, sharp and sudden, making me jump. I stared at the device, unsure if I should answer. The note's warning echoed in my mind. "If the radio crackles between midnight and 2 a.m., turn it off immediately." Instead, I hesitated, leaning closer to the device. Among the static, I thought I heard something, a voice, faint and distorted. "Help," the voice whispered, barely audible. I froze. The word was so soft, so broken that I couldn't even tell if it was male or female. My hand hovered over the microphone, torn between logic and fear. But before I could respond, the static faded into silence. I sat there for several minutes, staring at the radio. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Maybe it was a fluke. interference from another frequency, yet deep down I felt the weight of something unnatural. For the rest of the night, I didn't touch the radio. The following morning, the forest felt normal again. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm rays over the wooden floor. The events of the night felt distant, almost surreal, like a bad dream. I completed my morning scan and logged the weather conditions. Clear skies, light wind, no sign of smoke. The routine helped ground me, though I couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the back of my mind. Around noon, I decided to explore the emergency supplies. Among the basic first aid kits and canned food, I found a flare gun with 3 cartridges. The sight of it brought some comfort. If anything truly dangerous approached, I wouldn't be completely defenseless. The day passed uneventfully. I spotted a family of deer grazing near a stream and a hawk circling above the treetops. The simplicity of the scene helped me relax, and by evening I almost felt foolish for letting the night scare me so much. But as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the forest, the tension returned. I locked the trapdoor and braced myself for whatever this second night might bring. The knock came just past midnight. I bolted upright from the cot, my heart hammering in my chest. It was the same rhythmic thump I'd heard the previous night, 3 deliberate knocks spaced evenly apart. This time it came from the far wall of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight but hesitated. "Do not respond," the note had warned. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't the sound of branches or wind. It was deliberate, purposeful. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. After a few agonizing minutes, the knocking ceased, but the silence didn't last. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, weaving through the trees. At first, I thought it was a camper's flashlight, but the light moved too smoothly, too unnaturally. It bobbed and floated, growing brighter as it approached the cabin. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to close the shutters, fumbling with the latches as the light drew nearer. Its glow seeped through the cracks, bathing the room in an eerie, bluish hue. I ducked beneath the table, clutching the flare gun like a lifeline. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to count. 1, 2, 3. When I reached 50, I dared to peek. The light was gone. By the third day, I was questioning my sanity. The rules, the strange occurrences, the oppressive isolation, it was all starting to wear on me. I debated calling Ed to ask for an early pickup, but something stopped me. Pride? Curiosity? I wasn't sure. The daylight hours were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind felt like a prelude to something worse. The forest, once a source of awe, now felt hostile. Around noon, I noticed something strange on the far edge of the valley. A cluster of crows had gathered in the trees, their black forms silhouetted against the sky. They perched silently, their heads all turned toward the cabin. I tried to focus on my routine, but the sight of those birds lingered in my mind. It felt like an omen. The third night began like the previous 2, tense and heavy with anticipation. I went through my routine, performing a sweep of the forest with binoculars and logging the weather conditions. The clear skies and cool air did little to calm my nerves. Just before midnight, I noticed movement near the base of the tower. At first it was subtle, shadows shifting among the trees. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the deck, shining the beam downward. What I saw made my stomach drop. A group of animals had gathered at the base of the tower. There were deer, coyotes, and even a black bear standing unnaturally still. Their heads were all tilted upward, their eyes fixed on the cabin. The bear growled softly, the sound low and guttural, almost as if it were speaking to the others. I backed away from the railing, my mind racing. The note's warning rang clear. If animals surround the tower, don't go down to look. Fire your flare gun into the air twice, 1 minute apart, then lock yourself in the bathroom. Fumbling, I grabbed the flare gun from the emergency kit and loaded the first cartridge. With shaking hands, I aimed upward and fired. The flare arced into the night sky, painting the forest in blood-red light. The animals didn't move. I reloaded and fired the second flare. This time, a few of the smaller animals twitched, but none of them scattered. Their gaze remained fixed on the cabin, their bodies eerily still. I retreated into the cabin, locking the trapdoor behind me. My breathing was shallow as I barricaded myself in the bathroom, sitting on the cold floor with the flare gun clutched in my hands. The growling and scratching continued outside, a sinister symphony that lasted for hours. When dawn broke, the animals were gone. The forest was quiet again, but the tension in the air was undeniable. I completed my morning sweep, though I avoided looking at the ground beneath the tower. The memory of those glowing eyes haunted me. Around midday, I noticed something new. A strange symbol scratched into the bark of a tree near the base of the tower. It was a spiral, rough and uneven, as if etched in a hurry. I didn't recognize it, but something about the shape made my skin crawl. That night, as I tried to steel myself for whatever might come, the trapdoor rattled. The sound was faint at first, a soft creak of wood against metal. I froze, my eyes darting to the latch. Then came the voice. "Let me in," it called. It was deep, gravelly, and familiar. My heart sank as I recognized Ed's voice. "It's me," the voice continued. "I need to talk to you. Open the door." I hesitated, stepping toward the trapdoor, but then I remembered the note. "Do not acknowledge voices that come from outside." "Ed?" I called cautiously. "What are you doing here?" The trapdoor shook violently, the sound echoing through the cabin. "Open the door," the voice bellowed, no longer sounding like Ed. It was deeper now, more guttural, almost inhuman. I backed away, gripping the flare gun tightly. The pounding grew louder, the entire cabin trembling with each impact. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I stood there, frozen, listening to the silence. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. After a long moment, I dared to speak into the radio. "This is Tower 7, I said. "I need help. There's something out here." The radio crackled, but no voice came through. The fourth day was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and every sound in the forest felt like a threat. The crows had returned, their silent vigil continuing at the edge of the valley. I tried to ignore them, but their presence was impossible to forget. By evening, I felt like I was losing my mind. I considered abandoning the tower and hiking back to the base camp, but the thought of walking through the forest at night was even more terrifying. At midnight, the radio came to life again. "Tower 7, do you copy?" a voice asked. It was calm, professional, nothing like the distorted whispers from the previous nights. "I hear you," I said, my voice shaking. "I need help. There's something out here." "We're sending someone your way," the voice replied. "Stay put and keep the trapdoor locked." Relief washed over me. Finally, someone was coming, but an hour later the knocking returned. "Let me in," the voice called. This time it sounded like a woman. "Please, I'm hurt." I froze, torn between fear and instinct. What if it was a real person? What if someone was actually hurt? But then I remembered the note, the rules I'd already broken. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. I backed into the bathroom, locking the door and sinking to the floor. The flare gun felt heavy in my hands, but it was little comfort against the unknown. The pounding continued through the night, each impact shaking the cabin. I sat huddled in the bathroom, my nerves frayed, waiting for the first rays of sunlight to pierce the darkness. When dawn finally came, the forest was silent once more. I unlocked the bathroom door cautiously, stepping into the cabin. The trapdoor was intact, though faint scratches marred its surface. Outside, the ground beneath the tower was littered with deep claw marks, spiraling outward like a chaotic pattern. The radio crackled to life again. "This is Tower 7, I said quickly. "Is anyone coming?" There was a long pause before a voice replied, "Stay where you are. Help is on the way." An hour later, I saw headlights cutting through the forest. A truck pulled up at the base of the tower, and a man in a ranger uniform stepped out. Relief flooded through me as I watched him climb the stairs, but when he reached the trapdoor, something felt off. "Let me in," he said, his voice calm but insistent. "It's safe now." I hesitated, my hand on the latch. The note's warnings echoed in my mind. Do not acknowledge voices that come from outside. I glanced through the window and saw another truck pulling into the clearing. 2 more rangers stepped out, their faces grim. One of them grabbed a shotgun from the truck bed and motioned for the other to follow him. The man at the trapdoor knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door," he demanded, his voice deepening into something monstrous. I backed away as the pounding grew louder, shaking the entire cabin. Outside, the real rangers shouted something I couldn't make out. Gunshots rang out, followed by an unearthly scream that chilled me to my core. When the noise finally stopped, one of the rangers called out, "It's over. You can come down now." I hesitated, peering through the window. The clearing was empty, save for the 2 rangers standing near the truck. The other man, the one who had knocked, was nowhere to be seen. Slowly I unlocked the trap door and descended the stairs. The rangers looked tired but relieved. "You're lucky," one of them said. "Not everyone makes it out of these woods." They refused to answer any of my questions, loading me into the truck and driving me back to base camp in silence. When I arrived, Ed was waiting. He didn't ask me what happened, and I didn't offer any explanations. I handed in my gear and drove home, vowing never to set foot in those woods again. Weeks later, I received a letter from the Park Service. It was brief and to the point. "The incident at Tower 7 is under investigation. Do not discuss your experience with anyone." I shredded the letter, but the memories refused to fade. At night, I still hear the knocking, faint and deliberate, as if something is waiting just outside my door. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death,